Okay. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Good. Welcome, everyone. My name is Demetri Walters, and hello to my friend Justin, who I see is in the audience there. It's my pleasure to represent the PGI Wines of Crete on behalf of funding by the Greek government and also the EU. And I put together a presentation for you to make life a bit easier. You're welcome to text me as we go along. Probably best to wait until the end, and then you can speak to me, and I can speak to you back. Dave, will you unmute everyone at the end, or you can actually unmute people the whole way through if you like, and then you can ask me questions as and when. So my background is I'm a master of wine, an independent master of wine. I spent some 20 years or so working for Berry Brothers. I was unashamedly in the fine wine end of the market, and I'm commonly associated with the Eastern Med, particularly Greece and Cyprus, but also with fortified wines. But it's always my pleasure to talk about the wines of the Hellenic world. My mother is Greek, a Greek Cypriot, and Greece is a very ancient wine culture with so many native autochthonos grape varieties, and it's those today that I'll be focusing on. I won't be talking about producers. I'll be talking about 7 different grapes, one of which is in 2 incarnations, a rosé and a red wine. So without further ado, shall I get going? And you ask questions as you see fit. So Crete is a very ancient winemaking island. It has a viticultural history of at least 4,000 years. 4,000 years that we can prove, but probably a lot longer. Certainly, for my part in the Cypriot world, it's a good deal longer, but it probably isn't. It's just that's what has been proved. And we know that the Phoenicians and Egyptians traded wine both to and from Crete. And we know that the Egyptians did this because there's proof of it in Egyptian tomb paintings. Now, in the pre-palatial Minoan settlement of Pyrgos, which was resettled in about 1900 BC after its destruction a couple of hundred years before, there are amphorae remains, or pitharia, as they're called in the Greek world, containing wine residues. So the story of wine is indeed very ancient. And a myrtos, a tripod cauldron from a similar period, tiny bit later, has evidence of oak lactones as well as wine residue. Now, oak lactones wouldn't have been from oak barrels, but perhaps oak flavoring compounds. Clay presses. They used to make the presses, certainly the basins out of clay, exist from the Minoan and Mycenaean periods of the mid-2nd millennium BC. And remember from your schoolboy and schoolgirl history that the great eruption of Thera, now Santorini, that was about 1600 BC. That spelt the end of the Minoan civilization, the proto-European civilization, and gave way to the Mycenaeans, creating a hegemony over the whole of this part of the Hellenic world. And Cretan wine amphorae are depicted being unloaded from ships in this period, and a little bit later from Egyptian murals and paintings in their funerary rooms. Now, a continuing presence throughout antiquity, both classical Greek and the Roman period, the later Byzantine period and Venetian periods, was present on Crete. And after a hiatus during the Ottoman period, remember the Ottomans forbade the growing of grapes and the drinking of wine for their Muslim subjects, but also for their Greek subjects, their Cretan subjects. They permitted the growing of grapes and the making of wine, but forbade the selling of it. So having been at the center of the medieval wine trade, creating wines like Malvasia of Crete, one of the great sweet wines of the early medieval period, Crete became somewhat of a backwater during the Ottoman period. And it wasn't really until the 1990s that Cretan wine, as we know it today, really started. What of the climate of Crete? Well, depends where you are. It has a warm Mediterranean climate, by no means an extreme Mediterranean climate. You go further east towards Cyprus. Cyprus has a much warmer climate. You go to other parts of the Cyclades, just the island group just north of eastern Crete, and you'll find a more extreme climate than much of Crete. But for the great part, it's warm rather than hot, and the eastern end is warmer and drier than the western end, mostly northerly breezes. Sometimes there are strong winds from the Sahara, and they say that Crete is growing about a centimeter every 1,000 years because of Sahara dust. And certainly if you've been on holiday in that part of the world, you'll know that there's orange dust almost everywhere at certain times of the year. Annual rainfall ranges from a tiny 250, it should be millimeters, not meters, otherwise it'd be a problem, 250 millimeters to 900 millimeters. And vineyard elevation, particularly in the west, where the mountains come down to the sea, ranges from sea level to 1,000 meters. Now, as with much of the Eastern Med, the topsoils are limestone and clay, with elements in this part of the world, in Crete, of slate and red clay, iron-rich clay. And they have a substrata of schist and gravel in certain places. In total, just a very small amount of vineyards, 4,200 hectares of wine vineyards, many more given over to eating grapes, sultanina or Thompson seedless. And some of those grapes are actually used for base wine production, but 4,200 hectares of wine vineyards, 46,200 tons of wine grapes, 300,000 hectoliters of wine. Here's a rather basic, but very explanatory map. The White Mountains are in the west. They come down to the sea. They're only slightly lower than the Psiloritis range. You've heard of Mount Ida, the highest mountain in Crete. Well, that's part of the Psiloritis range, up to 2,456 meters. These are large mountains, and they play a very important part in viticultural practice. They're a major viticultural element of Crete. And as you go towards the east, the mountains are slightly lower, particularly in the Sitia region, part of Lasithie, in the far east of Crete. But they're still sizable. Now, there are 4 PGI zones as part of PGI Crete, and these range from Chania in the west, the mildest and wettest part of Crete, and then there's Rethymnon or Rethymno, the home of Vidiano, Iraklion, the main wine-growing region in the eastern center, and onwards to the driest part of Crete, which is Lasithie. There are 35 native varieties, or are there? Maybe a couple of those, according to ampelographical studies, are dubious. They might be replicated in Greece under other names, but certainly low to mid-30s unique native grapes. And it's 11 native PGI grapes, 7 of which we're talking about today. So we have Villana, Vidiano, Clito, Daphne, all very characterful grapes. Villana, Vidiano, Clito, and Daphne are very ancient grapes that were used in the creation of a sweet wine, and a passimento wine, or liasta staphyli as it's called, the drying of grapes under the sun for making that famous Malvasia of Crete. Assyrtiko, which is an import from the Cyclades, from Santorini, but it's considered a native grape now. Thrapsathiri, which has been resurrected a bit like Clito and Daphne from virtually nothing. Muscat of Spina, which is a particular type of, a permutation of Muscat of Alexandria. Malvasia di Candia, which is a permutation of Monemvasia or Malvasia from the Peloponnesos. Liatico, unique to Crete. Romaico, unique to Crete. And finally, Kotsifali and Mandilari. These are 2 of the rising stars of the red pantheon. Now, all these grapes are mid to late ripening, so they comfortably inhabit their environment. If they were early ripening in what is a warm, dry, high ultraviolet light region, they'd be harvesting at possibly the worst time of the year to do so. So they ripen in September, October. First off, good news is we can start tasting. Wine number one. I knew my little diploma glasses from years ago would come in handy. Vidiano. Now, on the map here, you can see the spread of Vidiano from the far west, Chania, through Rethymnon, which is its home, into Iraklion. Hardly found in the far east, though, in La City. In terms of alcohol, sure, it can produce a fair amount of alcohol. Generally high alcohol, not so much anymore. Usually moderate alcohol, around 13 and a half. Acidity, it's pretty zesty, it's pretty high, but not as high as Assitico. Quite full-bodied, has a fair amount of dry extract, and has quite a lot of intensity on the palate. Now, this particular wine is from a single vineyard, Vidiano. It's from a wider estate of 15 hectares. That's the whole extent of this smallholder, the small producer. And the grapes from this Vidiano come from about 350 to 550 meters. As you can see from the photograph, you can see the lay of the land. This is very typical for Crete and the islands associated with it, limestone and clay. This goes through typical white wine fermentation in stainless steel, no wood, fairly cool fermentation, around about 16 degrees average. So between 15 to 17. It spends 3 months on fine lees. So when you taste it, it does have a little bit of yeasty, leesy, oyster shell character. I'm a big fan of this wine, not just from this particular producer who has to remain anonymous, but I like Vidiano because out of all the grapes that were coming out of a sort of post-Ottoman anonymity and being resurrected and being taken out of field blends and planted on their own, Vidiano was the first white grape of Crete to really show its mettle. I used to import wines made from Vidiano because they were so characterful, honeyed, textured. They don't need wood. They have good acidity. They have a body to them. They even make really good skin fermented or orange wines. And they're terrific food accompaniments. I've written down some of the things that I think they work with: river and sea fish, vegetable dishes, poultry, pasta dishes. And if you were eating in Crete, you'd be having all those things at the same time in the Greek style, the meze style. And a wine like this can make sense of all those, including white meat. Have a go at that. It's a pretty hot day here in central London. Must be 30, 31. So I'm going to spit out. So I'm feeling pretty desiccated already. Vidiano, and we're going to revisit that with wine number 4. I hope you like that. And give me your thoughts at the end. If you have something pressing you'd like to ask or say, please do so during the conversation, during my talk. Now, this is a white wine, but we're looking at what are definitely red grapes. This is wine number 2. There are not that many wines made from red grapes that we make ultimately cepage white wines out of. And this is one of them. Of course, champagne and other sparkling wines often employ red grapes rather, to make white wine. But there are not that many still wines. Sometimes in Alsace, you might find Pinot Noir making really good white wine. In the Greek world, it's not that uncommon. And this particular grape is a denizen of the far west of the island, the coolest, wettest part of the island, with the mildest climate. Pardon me. As a red grape, it has fairly low-level tannins. Can produce quite high levels of alcohol, not this particular one. The acidity is quite modest as a red wine. As a white wine, generally higher. It's made in a different way. Body, moderate. The intensity, I think medium is a bit mean. I think it can produce quite a lot of intensity. I think this is one of those grapes that is a work in progress. Now, this is not a black grape. It's more of a pink grape, a little bit like Moscofidero from Mantinia, which is a white wine that also produces rosé. You can produce rosé out of Romeco. You can definitely produce red wine with long macerations. But what's it all about? Well, it's a native to the Chania region. Romeco calls to mind the way the Byzantines called themselves. They called themselves Romios, or Romans, and this celebrates that heritage. This particular wine is just 12.5% alcohol, which is why I say that actually Romeco as a white wine doesn't produce very high levels of alcohol. It can, but you'd have a much riper style than this with rather diminished acidity. It has a slight bronzy color to it. You can tell that it's been direct pressed from red grapes. It's got good acidity. I wouldn't say high. 4.8 is relatively, I say it's moderate, but its claim to fame is it's traditionally used for a very oxidized wine called Marouves. And Marouves was a wine that was made in years gone by and then left in cask or in pitharia, amphore, clay, for the duration of the child's growing up until they were adult, until they were 18 years old. And then, that's the traditional story, and then broached, resulting in a wine that resembled Oloroso sherry. Very, very oxidative. Have a go at this particular wine. I think it works excellently as a white wine. It's very characterful, and it's very typical of the far west of the island, and not much of it produced, even less so as a white wine. I've shown you a picture here of what Crete can look like. It can be very craggy and dry and windswept. The plantation of date palms kind of gives away the local climate here. But the other side of Crete is high altitude, abundant water. At least the rivers flow in autumn to spring. In the summer, I don't believe that Crete has any permanent rivers. But Crete can be very dry. It's particularly arid, but it doesn't necessarily get very, very hot. It ranges from moderately warm to bordering on extreme Mediterranean climate, but without being as hot as the far eastern Mediterranean. Those first two grapes have something in common in terms of the way they feel on the palate. They're textured, but I would say the Vidiano has more physiological presence than the Romeco. The Romeco has a more gentle mouthfeel, both very food friendly. Talking about the physicality of wine, these local grapes have similarities because they've grown up together over the course of centuries and millennia. During the ancient Greek period, the classical period, the Roman period, Byzantine and medieval period, but latterly under the Venetians before the Ottoman Turks seized the island, many of these grapes were used in the production of sweet wine. Many of them were blended together. Their characteristics were well known to the Cretan forebears. And it was during that Ottoman period of some 300 years that many of the characteristics of the grapes got lost for fairly obvious reasons, because people were drinking much, much less, and the whole trade was suppressed. But many of these grapes languished in complete obscurity. And this is common not just to Crete, but to elsewhere in the Hellenic world, to Greece itself, and to where I'm half from, to Cyprus. People knew the names of the grapes, but they didn't really know the characteristics of them. And in fact, some of them disappeared from understanding altogether. They were still there in small order. And when ampelographical studies came into being within the last 20 years, and people began to understand their native grapes better, whilst practicing on international grapes, which were better understood, many of these grapes, like Daphne, the name means bay leaf in bay in Greek, and it smells like bay leaf, or Thrapsathiri, which is a very characterful grape, I'll just describe it, they were brought back from near oblivion, almost nothing, sometimes just a handful of vines. In the case of Thrapsathiri, I remember for a while selling an early take on this, owned by one producer, who then gave the vines to various other people that they thought could make something of it. And that producer, for many years, only had 2 hectares of Thrapsathiri. And this particular one comes from the Heraklion area, from Daphnes, and this is a single vineyard at 350 meters. That altitude kind of tells you that Crete is not that hot. There are warmer places in this part of the world. If it was hot, they'd be quite a lot higher. Again, we're on limestone. And to bring out the aromatic precursors, both aroma precursors and flavor precursors of this wine, it goes through a cold maceration for about 6 hours. It spends some months in mostly seasoned wood for fermentation and maturation, very, very little new wood. And the result is this slightly pear skin, ripe apple, almost bruised apple, cider apple character. And this is very typical of this grape, Thrapsathiri. In years gone by, it was considered related to Athiri. Forgive my clock. It was related to Athiri in people's minds, the great, or one of the great white grapes of the Cyclades. Actually, they're not related. So it's known as Thrapsa, prolific Athiri. And it's anything but prolific. Maybe in the past it was considered prolific compared to many other grapes. But compared to the previous 2 wines, this has something different again. It has higher acidity than the Romeco, and it has a physicality, a physiological presence akin to the Vidiano. I think it's something rather less taut than the Vidiano, more opulent, and a bigger wine. It's rather good though, isn't it? Let's have a go. Vidiano again. Here we have something that is very fashionable right now, orange wine, and often orange wine and natural wines are conflated. Sometimes they can be the same thing. This is not a natural wine, certainly a low intervention wine, but it's very much a skin contact wine. And Vidiano lends itself to this style of wine because whilst it has some phenolic grip, it's not very, very phenolic. It doesn't have the kind of phenolic or tannic grip that, let's say, Assyrtiko would have, or that Pinot Gris or Riesling would have in Northern and Central Europe. So what are its characteristics? Well, we know from before it can produce relatively high alcohol. This one's not. It can produce, well, it says moderate or medium acidity, usually does better than that, produces quite full-bodied, textured wines, and wines that have significant intensity. So Vidiano has been recorded in Crete, proven to have been recorded in Crete since at least the 1200s, the 13th century. It's very drought tolerant. Whilst Crete is not that hot compared to many of its neighbors, it is dry. And between end of May and late October, it doesn't rain. It is susceptible to powdery mildew, and drought will exacerbate that. However, it's not a major problem. There's not that much disease pressure in the dry environment of Crete, where there's nearly always a gentle breeze. This is genetically related to the last wine we had, to the Thrapsathiri. This is wine number 4. So it's related to Thrapsathiri, and also a wine we haven't got here, Villana. Villana and Thrapsathiri, as you know, were brought back from near oblivion. There were just a number of vines of Villana and rather less than half a hectare of Thrapsathiri left anywhere in the Heraklion area, where they both originated from. Vidiano, whilst it's rare, wasn't quite as rare as those grapes and was perhaps easier to grow in the vineyard. in the past, when people got paid for the quality, grapes that were reliable generally got the most money and were planted the most. They weren't necessarily the best. So it lends itself to skin fermented or orange wine. Often we hear skin contact being used when people mean skin fermented. Skin contact is not skin fermented, it's just macerated. But when the fermentation begins, you end up with a wine like this. They usually have this change in color. Not always. There tends to be a diminishment of the primary fruit character, and there tends to be an increase in the physiological elements of the grape, the way the grape feels on the palate. Have a go at this. This is rather special. So whilst I said this is quite fashionable and modern, this is how nearly all white wine in this part of the world used to be made. And I remember when I was a child watching people macerating white grapes, putting them into a bin. Crushing them, putting them into an amphora or pitharia, the juice in contact with the skins, and then leaving them to ferment. And it was this maceration before, during, and after fermentation that led to the wines bearing a resemblance to this. Of course, in years gone by, when there wasn't an understanding until very recently as to consistent winemaking cleanliness, wines like this used to be spoilt often. They often had off flavors, and they still do sometimes. Sometimes I know that we all raise an eyebrow when we taste a supposedly natural wine, and of course natural and skin contact or orange often get conflated. But poor cleanliness can ruin a wine like this. This is very cleanly made, and it still has that lovely waxy texture of Vidiano. I hope you like that. I think that's rather a clever wine. I like the honeyed notes, the blossom notes that it still possesses. But it isn't all about white grapes. Quite a lot of it's to do with red grapes. And whilst the PGI native grapes of Crete are predominantly white, there are quite a few red as well. Let's get on to those. And I think one of the most exciting has to be Liaticum. Liaticum, historically, a bit like many red grapes of the region, was given over to making sweet wines, as well as dry or semi-dry wines. Producing completely dry wines was rather difficult in this part of the world until relatively recently, because of a lack of understanding of how microbes operated. But in the last 30 years, so many improvements have been made, and the great majority of winemakers are professional winemakers. It's what they do as their primary or only course of income. So Liaticum, it's a fairly light-colored grape. It hasn't got a high concentration of anthocyanins in the skins. It's quite thick-skinned. It produces relatively low-level tannins, can produce quite high alcohol, can produce quite high acidity, produces a lot of extract, and because it has this ability to produce quite a lot of alcohol, we can take it as given that it produces a lot of sugar, which is why it was so useful as a dried grape wine for producing sweet wines in the dim and distant past. Its home is the eastern half of Crete. This particular wine, as we can see, it's not red. It's not fizzy either. I think it's just, as I poured it quite recently. This particular wine is from Daphnes, which is the heart of the Iraklion region, about 340 meters, again on limestone. Typically wines of this color go through a very short pressing. Usually they go through direct press, a little skin contact, and then stainless steel, in this case, for a few months, but no wood. As a result, this is a fresh, fruity style of rosé designed to accompany lighter dishes. I think it's ideal for this kind of weather. So if you're eating maybe a salad, perhaps a fish-based salad, or as an aperitif, chilled with some nuts. It's perfect. This is 13.5% alcohol, and rosés of this ilk are very rarely higher than this. In order to bring out the various aroma and flavor precursors, you have to have a level of ripeness in the grapes, which results in a certain amount of sugar in the grapes, which means slightly more than moderate alcohol, but the acidity is still good here. I think this is a grape to watch. And when I've been tasting Greek wines of late and judging early this year in Greece, Liatiko, amongst many other grapes from the great pantheon of Greek grapes, and there are almost 300 of them that are unique to Greece, this was one of the grapes that I think was really showing something different from how it's been made in the past, showing something more authentic and perhaps, dare I say, more typical. Angus, are you talking about this grape or the previous grape in your note? You're talking about the Vidiano or the Liatiko? I'll tell you what, you can tell me at the end. We can have a chat. It's probably easier talking, isn't it, than
the Tratsipari.
The Trapasatheri. Oh, sorry, I'm so slow on the draw. You know, I haven't done this for about 18 months. I've sort of almost forgotten how to do it. It's I'm with you on that. Out of all these wines, the wine that I have the most of in my own cellar is Trapasatheri, and I would say Daphne is another one to look out for. And in the recent 50 Great Greek Wines nominations, both of these grapes were lauded, as was Liatiko above all other.
Yeah, Liatiko I think is really exciting.
It's very exciting, isn't it? So now the red Liatiko, wine number 6. This is what Liatiko does red wine, more recently rosé. Rosé is quite a new concept in the Greek world. They've been making rosés for the last, well, certainly for tourists and to a degree for export for the last 30 years, but they've really caught our attention in terms of being balanced in the last, I think, 10 or 15 years. Why is that? Well, it's hard making a rosé. You'd imagine it'd be easy through saignée, through bleeding the grapes, having a maceration of the skins and the juice together. But getting the balance of sugars, flavor and aroma precursors, and physiological elements all in balance, it's pretty difficult, isn't it? Again, this is from Daphnes, tiny bit higher than the previous wine, just 10 meters, was that 35 feet, on limestone. This spends 12 months in wood, in mostly seasoned French oak. These will be small barrels. And have you seen the acidity here? It's pretty good, isn't it? 6 grams of tartaric. That's not high again, but it's certainly fresh. And many of these wines, many of these grapevines rather, will be rooted on their own roots. Parts of Crete suffer from phylloxera, parts didn't. Now, there are grape residues that can definitively be linked to Liatiko dating back to the 3rd century BC. So when you see those mosaics in places like Crete, or other parts of the Hellenic world, you can imagine what they might have been drinking. It says a deep black grape. It can be, often a little bit paler than that, a sort of purpley grape with progeny, many of them, relations, on the mainland of Greece. Have a go at the Liatiko as a red wine, where it's really making waves. I'm trying to spit off screen because I've lost my spittoon, which is black, and I'm just using a see-through Tupperware at the moment. Not the most attractive look for a spittoon. So Liatiko has quite a lot of presence, doesn't it? It has quite a lot of phenolic grip. The tannins are not high level though. You can feel them, but they're relatively modest. They're just very fine grained. And it doesn't need wood, certainly doesn't need new wood, I would say. Old wood gives it some oxidative complexity. And if this wine had a lick of new wood, well, That's not a problem at all. But it has that lovely bitter cherry or sour cherry character, something quite Italianate, if you will. And it's unsurprising that Italy and Greece have a relationship in terms of the way their wines often taste, because a lot of the grape varieties that are hallowed in Greece, in Italy, originated in Greece in the classical period. Here's another very well-known, at least in Crete, very well-known black grape, and this is Kotsifali. It's a much tighter bunch than Liatico, perhaps not such an ancient grape, and it's come to my attention, and this is my view, and you need to speak to someone like Joseph Wiamos if you want proof of this, but a lot of very ancient grape varieties, if I can talk about Xinomavro, for instance, or Liatico, or Mavro Calavritino, they have quite stringy bunches. Kotsifali is merely old rather than ancient, and it has a much tighter bunch. In fact, sometimes I've seen Kotsifali on the vine that are almost round, like an orange. And Kotsifali produces quite low-level tannins, can produce a lot of sugar. It's a great blending agent if you want something that's richer and riper. Produces moderate acidity, a fair amount of body, but it has a lot of intensity on the palate. Excuse me. Kotsifi, or blackbird, because this is what the blackbird's like. And it's hardly surprising, it produces a lot of sugar, and this is what they come and peck and will make off with. So low tannin, moderate acidity, that makes it the ideal blending partner of Mandillari, and Mandillari is 20% of this blend, Kotsifali, the great majority, 80%. They're often co-planted and co-fermented, and they're co-fermented in this case. Now, I remember a time when I first went to Crete where Kotsifali was not much to write home about. It used to oxidize very easily, as did many grapes all around the world until quite recently. In fact, some of them still are, depending on where you are. But Kotsifali used to be poorly handled. There wasn't a good understanding because of the rather rustic winemaking. All that has changed, and improved viticulture has given this grape a varietal character that is thoroughly authentic. It's one of the best known grapes in Crete, almost a tenth of total production. 400 hectares make it a very widely planted grape. And it's usually situated at fairly modest elevation. It benefits from that combination of relatively high heat and high ultraviolet light. If it was much, much higher than this, as at 260 meters, it might have a problem ripening. So it's highly attuned to heat. It's highly attuned to very high levels of ultraviolet and extremely arid soils. I say arid, whilst there's a fair amount of clay topsoil in these limestone soils of most of Crete. Remember that limestone holds water where the roots are need it most, 2 or 3 meters down. 13% alcohol and 5.5 grams of tartaric acid. Oh, Tim, I'm glad you like the Liatico. And Justin's agreeing. Yeah, and they do tend to vary from vintage to vintage. And there's lots of vintage variation in Crete because it has a Libyan climate in the south, very dry, arid winds, very arid, warm winds coming in. But from the north, you get slightly cooler winds coming off the southern Aegean. So they do vary, you're quite right. So that's Kotsifali, quite fat, fairly modest acidity, relatively high alcohol, mated with something or blended with something that is altogether chewier, higher in tannin, higher in acidity, with a fair amount of dry matter and chew, and that is Mandillari. Now, Mandillari is altogether a rather difficult grape to grow in comparison. And remember, in more rustic times, it's a very typical view of Crete, arid, quite monocultural in the wine growing regions. Although I think Crete has something like 30 million olive trees. There's an awful lot of olives, way more olive trees than people, way more. Mantillari, look at this, a rather ancient variety, strung out, very deep colored berries, high tannins, modest alcohol, pretty high acidity, and altogether a rather meaner grape than Kotsifali. So it's planted all around the Eastern Aegean, and it has various names, as you can see, like Mavrokudura, Onevia, Mantillaria and Paros, and it's called Mantillari here in Crete. And it's the most widely planted grape on Crete, even though it's a pretty tall order. It's a difficult grape to grow. People see nowadays that it's really worth it. 500 hectares. Now, Mantillari is very late ripening, often in October, which for a black grape in this part of the world, this far south, is really quite something. And it produces wines of around 10.5 to 12% ABV, quite low in alcohol. And then they're often pretty firm and chewy. So what's its biggest problem? Well, it's thrapsa, it's prolific. And you have to drop some of the unripe fruit quite close to veraison in order to restrict the yields. Otherwise, you end up with wines that are stemmy and green and herbal and rather vegetal. So in order to ripen it fully, it needs a long ripening season and a late ripening season. It prefers a cooler site, which might be north-facing, and there are various genetic improvements underway. Just 2 clones that we know of at present, more, I'm sure, in the offing. This wine, rather riper than the norm, 14% alcohol, and a fairly whopping 7 grams of tartaric, which is high for a red wine. Have a go. That is chewy, isn't it? Most wines of this region, in my view, are not given the stretch they deserve in terms of their ageability, because the culture is to drink them young. They can age. Liatico can definitely age. Mantillari can definitely age when it has this level of ripeness. Now, that ripeness is under a veil of chew at the moment, but it certainly has a nascent fruit coming through. And I think wines like this deserve to be put away for a number of years and to be brought out when they have something rather more tertiary, non-fruited, dry-fruited, to show what they're about. It actually puts me in mind of Xinomavro, albeit a completely different color, that great grape of Macedonia. Now, I've got some interesting or boring facts on Crete, which I thought might be of some interest to you. 50% of Crete is located at an altitude of more than 500 meters. It's considered the oldest inhabited part of Europe. The Lasiti Plateau is the largest flat area of Crete, an altitude on average of 850 meters. You can see the dimensions of Crete there, 260 by 60 meters, making it the 3rd largest island in the Mediterranean. Most rivers only have water after a heavy rain and tend to dry up in the driest summers. It has a huge coastline. They say the seawater is so clear, I would say in parts, you can see down 40 meters. Now, in 365 BC, a catastrophic earthquake raised the western part of Crete up 9 meters and destroyed a lot of the classical culture. The highest mountain is, as we know, Mount Daida in the Psiloroutis range at 2,456 meters. That's almost 9,000 feet. Snow is very common in the big mountains from November right through to May. And this is the best source of water for Cretan viticulture, if it's needed for young vines, that is. Now, in southern Crete, swallows do not migrate. They don't need to. It's warm. Otherwise, you'll go to Africa. Now, there are over 30 million olive trees on Crete. I think for the size of the island and the population, that must make it one of the most highly populated by olive trees countries, if not the most, on the planet. I hope you enjoyed the tasting, and please ask any questions you might like to. Unmute yourselves and just.
We spoke about like the different altitudes and the height of the mountains. But what effect does the height of the mountains have on the vineyards? Is it to do with wind? Is it to do with sun? Like what effect on the growing?
Very good question. Very good question. If you're north facing, then you're trying to not have such a strong ripening effect in the northern hemisphere. And many vineyards, if they're looking for something cooler, many viticulturalists will look for a north-facing slope. High mountains create something called katabatic winds, which means the warmth of the day can no longer support the cold air of altitude at night. And that cold air winds over and precipitates down the mountain, which means it floods the vineyard in cold air. So the diurnal variation in Cretan vineyards is dramatic. So daytimes are warm, but not incredibly hot. Night times are cool. As a result, you get a great retention of acidity.
That effect is on the south-facing slopes.
That's on both slopes, but on north-facing slopes, you don't get so much sunlight, do you?
Got it.
Because in the northern hemisphere, the sun comes round to the south,
yep.
Or rather, it does in terms of our orientation to the sun. Anything else anyone would like to ask?
Demetri, I was reading Konstantinos Lazarakis' book on the wines of Greece.
Yes.
And he was talking about, I mean, it really surprised me that phylloxera arrived in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Which certainly surprised me. I mean, you know, because it's quite late and it's quite, you know, what sort of an impact has this had in terms of the varieties and in terms of the wine growing there on the island?
It hasn't been catastrophic, but it's been a very major problem. Remember, right. Phylloxera doesn't survive everywhere. For instance, on Santorini, there isn't phylloxera, not because the isolation of Santorini is so effective. Yeah. This is Greece, after all. It's not Germany. You know, the rules in place are strict, but there are always ways of getting vine material in illicitly. It's because certain parts of the island have very low organic matter. If you have
sandy soil.
Sandy soil, and if you have less than something like 6% organic matter, it's very difficult for the louse to go through its secondary cycle in the roots. And it's that secondary cycle, not the munching of the canopy, but the munching of the roots and the starvation of the vine that creates a problem. So it hasn't been catastrophic. There are old vines on Crete that didn't suffer in the first place from phylloxera. Does that answer your question, Justin? I think it's Justin. I can't see you.
Oh, you can't see me. Okay. Yeah. Pretty much. I was just surprised at the fact that it came so late, and because we're talking about the revival of all these wonderful varieties, that it doesn't seem to have impacted to that degree. But I guess you've explained part of the reason for that.
I think I'm going to stop sharing. I think the reason is isolation. There wasn't genetic vine material coming in until relatively recently. I think that's the main story. And quite a lot of Crete has been viticulturally hostile to the louse. So I would say those two reasons are probably the principal reasons. If I can talk about Cyprus, I know this is about Crete, but if I can make an analogy with Cyprus, a place that I know very well indeed, there's no phylloxera, and just as well, because very, very few vines are planted on American rootstocks. So if it does come in, it might be a bit disastrous. But until recently, until maybe 50 years ago, very little vine material was coming in at all. Very little. It was only with the introduction of introduction of international varieties that danger made itself known. And that's what happened in Crete in the 1970s. People bringing in Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon and trying Chardonnay, thinking, people understand how to make this, and I studied Lincoln or I studied in Bordeaux, whatever, I'm going to give it a go. And
let's try and grow this here, yeah.
And they brought in the disease off the back of that inquiry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Good. Now, I hope you enjoyed the tasting. I hope I hope the grapes and the blend spoke for themselves, and they've given you food for thought in terms of what Crete can do in terms of just these 7 indigenous PGI varieties. I think, if I can speak for myself, I agree with, I think it was Tim earlier who was talking about Thrapsathiri. I think it's very exciting. It's a very exciting grape.
It was me.
And you haven't seen anything yet. I think there's much more to come. I mean, Cliton and Vilana have yet to talk more. They're planted in low volumes. Vidiano is going from strength to strength. And as the white grape, I think perhaps it's the white grape that is showing the most variation at the moment. Romeco, a black grape, but producing a cepage white wine, I think is extremely exciting. It's rather delicious and quaffable, that wine. But also, going back to something very classical, very ancient, almost rustic actually in terms of its nature, but a thoroughly fashionable wine, this orange wine, wine number 4. And of course, not all orange wines are orange in colour. There are many that are good white wines that are fermented on skins, albeit not for a very long time, to avoid an overt phenolic grip.
I really liked the orange wine. I thought it was delicious, but maybe that just sort of pigeonholes me as someone that likes that sort of cool stuff. But I was going to say, like, there's a consistency with the 3 whites that we tried. Maybe not the Romeco, of a sort of slight sort of phenolic grip that had like a nice texture to them. Is that just native to the grape variety, or is that to do with the grapes adjusting to the heat of the island?
They're completely at home in the island, so I think it's a feature of their inherent physiological elements in the skins.
Would that give the white grapes thicker skins?
Yes, it would. Yeah. Just like our skin thickens and pigments to protect us from the sun, grapes do a similar thing. Vilana doesn't have this texture. Daphne does to a degree. Vidiano does. Clito, not so much. So they aren't all like that, but it depends where they've grown up and the kind of environment that they've been produced in. What I would say is, even though many Cretan producers experimented with non-native grapes over the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even noughties, nowadays the main thrust is on indigenous varieties. And it's a work in progress. They're just getting better and better as they become better understood. And I think you can taste that in the Liatico. I remember tasting Liatico, I don't know, 15, 17 years ago, and it was nothing like this. Its typicity wasn't really that obvious.
Thinking about where Crete is now on like the international stage, and its sort of, you know, preference towards indigenous varieties. Are there any other countries around the world that it's sort of maybe following in the same trajectory of, like Portugal with its indigenous varieties, or any? Can
I talk about a close neighbour? This is about Crete. Cyprus. Cyprus we're uncovering native varieties all the time. 10 years ago, there were 12. Now we've discovered there are 18. So they're coming out of the sort of post-Ottoman woodwork, if you will. And they're very exciting. And they have, in Cyprus, they have a lot of the grapes have a similar character. They've certainly grown up in the same environment or similar environment. But Greece is uncovering grapes. Yes, Portugal is really showing its native varieties. And we see this. I talk a lot about the Douro, the wines of port, white and red, and the dry whites of the Douro are really coming to the fore. They're pretty good. And those of you who like eating seafood will know how well they go with seafood. I think everywhere in the Mediterranean basin is having a resurgence, a revolution, if you will, and they're really showing off themselves. There's much more of a reliance on international varieties in Spain, because they've been in Spain for so much longer than elsewhere. And there's been that relationship with Bordeaux and Rioja for a century and a half, for instance. But I would say Portugal is a good example, yeah. Now, Helen, I don't know where all these grapes are available, but Dave, I think, can tell you, and Dave Murphy. But also, if you look at Wine Searcher, and you put in, because we can't, I'm afraid we can't, because of the way it's been run, we can't divulge the names of these wineries. But You can find from places like Thorman Hunt, from Novum, from Berkman, from Maltby and Greek, particularly the latter. You can find all manner of Cretan grapes, Cretan wines, rather. I hope that helps a bit.
Demetri, did you?
Oh, sorry,
on
the
that
Wine
subject,
Society.
I mean,
Wine
Crete
Society
until
too.
very recently really has been a sort of, and also, oh, yeah. Crete's been very much a sort of also ran, sort of amongst other Greek regions. Should it be focusing on one or two varieties to try and spearhead its, you know, to try and boost its reputation, to try and boost its presence? You know, I mean, Santorini's obviously gone with Acertico, and other regions have gone with the grapes that they're best known for. Crete has kind of got these 6 or 7 varieties that we've been talking about here. Do you reckon they should be focusing on one or two just to get themselves more, you know, better known?
I think more than one or two. I think having sold quite a lot of Cretan wine in the past, when it's good, it's really easy to sell. You just have to create a conversation. And the Wine Society do a good job of selling Cretan wine. I think it's quite hard selling more than 5 or 6, because people kind of lose the focus. They certainly need to be sold. They need to be made aware of them. But I think there are certain grapes that should be given the laurels. And I think for me, Vidiano is one. Perhaps Atheria is another. I think Daphne, which is not present here, is another Cretan white grape. In the reds, I think Liatico has to have it. I think Liatico has to be given a push, and it is. So they get a push as a result of wine competition. And I notice, judging with 50 Great Greek wines and judging with decanter, that Greek wine is given a lot more credence now than it was several years ago, because there's been such a high preponderance of silver medals and many, many gold medals, as I'm sure you know from reading the various adjudication reports. But I think, you have a point. I think all the varieties need to be showcased. I think a smaller number of them, more than 1 or 2, I think that's a bit mean. But I think maybe 5 or 6 should be given the laurels.
Can I ask, bit controversial, but I think the Liatico is from a winery called Diamantikis. I'm not sure if that's the case.
I can't comment.
Is there a reason?
I can tell you it's not, but I can't comment. That one is particularly good though, isn't it? Yeah. Italian.
Is there a particular reason why we're not seeing who makes those wines?
Not my doing. It's something to do with the funding of this, I believe.
Okay, because I think it's useful to know. I mean, obviously, I believe that you probably pick those because they're good examples of the wines, and it's always useful to know, you know, who makes the wines, particularly if people want to buy them.
I agree, and I agree. I don't think it detracts from the grapes not knowing, but I would like to talk about the producers, but it wasn't on offer.
Okay, no, that's fine. It's good to know. I'm sorry that
you're my pay grade, I'm afraid. Now, I want to answer some questions. Is awareness of Cretan wines increasing amongst UK consumers? Yes. As someone who imported, one of the first importers in the UK of Cretan wine, I can say it's definitely caught on. They're produced in small quantities. They're never going to flood the market. We talk about Acertico. Justin mentioned Acertico is the grape that put, to a degree, Greece, but Santorini on the map. But what people don't know is that cheaper Acertico that you find, let's say from Hatzidakis in supermarkets, is made with Edani and Atheria as well, companion grapes, which grow together. But it's definitely gaining traction in the UK market, and you find it mostly in the on-trade, which I think is the right way around. We live in increasingly a small plates culture, and these kind of wines lend themselves to that kind of eating. They're also affordable as well. Oh, that's Wines of Crete talking to, sorry, that's Dave talking to Eloise. But what are some of the key export markets for Cretan wines? As far as I'm aware, Eloise, Greece, Cyprus, the Hellenic world, UK, increasingly, Switzerland, the Swiss are very into all Greek and Hellenic wine, and America. Hope that helps. Can't give you figures.
Yes.
You know, like the sort of rough total production for Crete as a sort of region? Are they producing loads of wine, or is it like pretty niche?
Tell you what, let me share screen, because I kind of wrote it on my presentation, didn't I? And
maybe I missed that.
No, I just can't remember what I said. Let me just go back. $300,000 hectoliters of wine. It's quite a lot.
It's quite a lot.
Yeah.
How many producers, Demetri?
That sounds like you know, I'm not sure the answer to that, Justin. I don't know. I think it's in the region. I think it's in the region of something like 50 major producers, but well over 100 producers.
Is there any like sort of one or two dominant big producers, or is it lots of fragmented small producers?
No, it's fragmented. There are some mainland Greek producers who are big, but in terms of the quality stakes, no, it's the smaller producers have it.
There's no like cooperative or anything on the island.
Oh, there are cooperatives.
Yeah,
but they're not significant.
They're still small. Okay.
Yeah. Right, well, I'm aware we have to close, but I hope that was of interest to you, and I hope it was, as well as being interesting, I hope the quality of the wines spoke through. They're certainly characterful. They have great personality. Yep. They're terrific food wines, and in a world where everything seems to be getting more expensive, they're so affordable.
Definitely.
Amazing. Can we get just a question to Wines of Crete? Can we get a copy of the slides?
This is my slideshow, and you're welcome to have it. And
can you send those round to us, maybe?
Yes. In fact, Antonis or Dave Murphy can do that. But you're absolutely welcome to them.
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Just as a really got it.
Don't use them on other slideshows, but if you can use them for yourself.
Just for like study purposes.
Yeah, yes, of course. Not a problem at all.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Anything else? I think that's probably it. I have to go and fan myself now. My flat, I think, is probably hotter than it is outside.
Thank you.
Very Cretan, Demetri. Gets us into the mood.
Good. All right, all. Have a good remainder of the day, and enjoy the remainder of those wines a little later on, and tomorrow, and perhaps the day after. I'll see you all.
Super.
If you have any questions, you can always email me. And I have it's demetriwalters@gmail.com. And if you forget, I have a website, demetriwalterswine.com. And I'll see if I can answer any questions or put you in touch with people who can. Bye-bye all.